How a romance novel saved the galaxy by Ariana Derrote. Chapter 30. Palpatine. Senator Sheev Palpatine was fuming! His master had advised him not to move directly on the true Mandalorians. This was, as was rather typical, hypocritical of his master, considering he provided several lines of funding to Death Watch through the intergalactic banking clan. His moon master followed the rules of the line of Bane, subtly supporting the continuation of the Great Plan through countless small movements across the galaxy, which would ultimately lead to the fall of the Jedi and the rise of a Sith Empire. But his master was also preoccupied with his scientific research into eternal life, and had pretty much left large swaths of implementing the Great Plan to his apprentice, once he used his influence to get Sidious installed as the Senator of Naboo. The Great Plan mentioned nothing about the Mandalorians. Sidious had done his own research, particularly into those Sith who had interacted with the Mandalorians during the Mandalorian Wars. Most of those sources agreed that Mandalorians were excellent tools in the hands of the Sith. Sidious thought they might perhaps be the tool that brought down the Jedi, since they were the only people who could consistently fight and kill Jedi in battle. Master Plagius disagreed and thought it was enough to simply foster unrest in the Mandalorian sector. This brought Sidious to now and the failure of his two-pronged plan to both take out the true Mandalorian and tarnish the Jedi. He was honestly unsure if it had been the influence of the Sith before him or just some bureaucrat credit pincher that set up the truly delightful rules for requesting Jedi a century before. Either way, he had been maliciously delighted to discover that Senate researchers were following bureaucratic guidelines to strip pertinent details from Senate mission requests to the Jedi in order to save money by requesting the smallest possible team of Jedi for each mission. Sidious had helped this along by inserting word limits to the requests, causing the Senate researchers to excise even more information. That and some judicious work at the other end of mission requests meant that many Jedi were dying without backup on what were supposed to be routine missions. Even better was that the Jedi still hadn't noticed. Of course, this had presented him with a problem when the governor of Galadron's request came into the Senate. He wanted the Senate to send as many Jedi as possible, first to ensure that the true Mandalorians died, especially their reformer of a Mandalore Maril, and second, to make sure as many Jedi were exposed to the anger and guilt of first slaughtering the Mandalorians, and then discovering they were wrong about doing so. The anger, guilt, and despair would drive many of them away from the Order, and possibly into the arms of the dark side. He had posed as a fellow anonymous mask collector to get the ear of the governor of Galadron ages ago, then facilitated the man's links to Death Watch several months before. Knowing the man's character and Death Watch's attempts to kill Maril, he was delighted to see his efforts bear fruit when the request came from Galadron. But it had required some work on his part to bribe the Senate researchers to ignore the usual guidelines on how many Jedi could be sent out on a mission. He was angry with this Jedi Master Dooku for ruining his plans. Instead of taking the Senate research at its word, he had the audacity to question the governor, and the governor had floated like the flimsy he was. Today, the Jedi had sent a request that the Senate researchers review their practices. Now the true Mandalorians were fine, and the Jedi had killed only Death Watch Mandalorians. Bah! What a waste of effort, and he just knew he was going to be punished by Plagius once he got wind of the failure of the scheme. Well, he wasn't going to make that mistake again. This new request from the new Mandalorians would go through unaltered by him. While as a senator, he praised their dedication to pacifism and removing the warlike aspects of Mandalorian culture inwardly, he praised more their passion for destroying anything that made their culture unique. In particular, he greatly approved of how they excluded non-humans from their members and didn't follow the ridiculous Mandalorian propensity for adopting anything that moved and considering them family. He'd have to ensure that the warriors in Mandalorian culture didn't die out before he could use them to destroy the Jedi, but he could easily see a future where the new Mandalorians weakened their people to the point that he'd be able to sweep in as head of the new Sith Empire and steal all the Beskar mines. It was a delightful image, especially since the prices of Beskar had been rising these past few months. Sidious had a share in several mines on Concordia, so he wasn't particularly concerned, but his quick research into the matter had turned up a popular article by a Mandalorian armorer explaining the proper wearing of Beskar, so there did seem to be some sort of fad driving the prices up. Like all fads, it would die down eventually, but he hoped it happened soon. It was making him money, yes, but it was also using up the limited supply of Beskar. In the meantime, Sidious just needed to come up with a new plan to bring the true Mandalorians down and leave the new Mandalorians in control if he wanted to make his vision of making all of the Beskar mines his own a reality. Well, fulfilling this request of the new Mandalorians would once again place the Jedi in conflict with both the true Mandalorians and Death Watch. He doubted they were friendly to begin with, considering the potential misunderstanding at Galadran. Yes, the new Mandalorians accusing Death Watch and the true Mandalorians of stealing their children was the perfect new mission to continue encouraging dissent between the Jedi and the Mandalorians. The fortress was nestled at the top of the cliff, 2 guard towers on either end, and at the center was a massive Durasteel door. As they had planned, Hiam faked a limp while Nared pretended to be helping him towards the door. "Kran?" asked a voice inside Nared's Barabuche. He didn't respond, and instead made the hand gesture for his comm being down. Their comms echoed with curses, but the door opened. Hiam's arm around his shoulders felt like Durasteel. It was so tense. A Mandalorian in gray armor stood there with Boucher on, but their stance conveyed annoyance. "Heading over to the medics," said Nared, hoping the Boucher's sound projector disguised his voice enough. "Obviously!" said the Mandalorian, throwing his hands up. "Gargan, Jedi! You're the only ones who made it back this time!" Nared steered them in the direction where the medics were usually set up in a standard Mandalorian camp and tried not to brace too much for a shot in the back. If he turned in the wrong direction, they'd immediately be found out. Several heartbeats passed. Hiam's hand moved to touch the back of his neck, where it was covered by his bodysuit. He squeezed once. That meant they were okay, and they were no longer being directly observed. The enemy Mandalorian's comment meant what Nared and Hiam suspected was true. They didn't know Hiam was working with a Mandalorian. Darjeti and Mandalorians were common battle partners, but the Jedi and a Mandalorian? It was almost inconceivable, despite how much Nared now knew. It was the perfect pairing. Nared found himself grinning beneath his bouche. These Darmanda were in for a surprise.